Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to welcome a guest whose journey beautifully bridges the world of science and storytelling. Business Talk is honored to host Dr. Helen Pearson as our distinguished guest in today's episode. Dr. Helen began her career with a deep curiosity about how life works, studying natural sciences at the University of Cambridge and going on to complete a PhD in developmental genetics at the University of Edinburgh. But along the way, she discovered that her true passion lay not just in doing science, but in bridging it into life through words, making complex ideas accessible, meaningful, and impactful. That passion led her to nature, where she has spent over 2 decades shaping some of the most influential science journalism in the world. As senior editor, she led a large award-winning team and was recognized as Editor of the Year by Association of British Science Writers. Today, she continues to craft deeply reported feature stories exploring topics that sits at the heart of our times, from artificial intelligence and science policy to mental health. Her writing has earned international recognition, including being named European Science Journalist of the Year in 2025, along with several prestigious awards. Beyond journalism, Dr. Pearson is also a celebrated author. Her book, The Life Project, received widespread acclaim, while her latest work, Beyond Belief, How Evidence Shows What Really Works, explores why evidence, not intuition, should guide the decisions that shape our world. Alongside her work at Nature, she teaches science communication at University College London. And in 2026-27, she will join MIT as a Knight Science Journalism Fellow. Based just outside London, she balances an extraordinary professional life with the everyday richness of family life. Dr. Helen Pearson, it is a true pleasure to have you with us today on Business Talk. The honor is entirely ours.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for that lovely introduction.
Thank you. Dr. Helen, if you had to open this conversation with a single story that captures the evidence revolution, which moment or character from the book would you choose? And why does it symbolize the shift from opinion to evidence in decision making?
I think the story I found that resonates most, that symbolizes the importance of not using unsubstantiated opinion, using evidence instead, is one I wrote about at the beginning of my book. And it centers on a particular book by a pediatrician called Benjamin Spock called Baby in Childcare. And this book was released in the 1940s, and it became a huge parenting bestseller worldwide. So the most popular parenting book ever sold, really. And in the 1958 edition of this book, Dr. Spock made a small change to the text. So previously he'd suggested that babies should be put to sleep on their backs, and he suggested instead in this 1958 version that babies should be put to sleep on their fronts. Now, he didn't really have particularly strong there wasn't really any evidence to support this, basically, but because it was such a popular book, parents started to follow this advice and lay their babies to sleep on their fronts. Now, meanwhile, a more sinister development was taking place, where more and more children in Western countries were dying from sudden infant death syndrome, so dying in their cribs, also known as SIDS. And there was a big debate about why this was. It wasn't fully understood. And what was needed in this conversation was evidence from careful observational studies, actually what are called case control studies, where you compare a group of children who have sadly died from SIDS with a group who didn't, who are very similar, and try and tease out the factors involved. So about 1965, 1970, the first of these studies came through. It was still quite unclear what was increasing risk of SIDS, but over time the evidence built up from research. And in fact, it showed that putting children to sleep on their fronts increased the risk of SIDS. And so this advice, this non-evidence-based advice from Dr. Spock and other paediatricians has since been recognised as one of the most lethal pieces of unsubstantiated advice in the history of child health. And once policy changed and parents were advised to lay their babies to sleep on their backs, then the rates of SIDS dropped. And it was later calculated that if the evidence had been acted on earlier, potentially tens of thousands of babies' lives could have been saved, or deaths could have been prevented if the evidence had been acted on earlier. So I think a really, a sort of powerful cautionary tale, I suppose, in science of how important of the harm that can potentially be done by unsubstantiated advice and the importance of using evidence from research.
Professor, you trace how medicine moved from tradition and expert opinion to evidence-based practice in the 90s. What was the turning point that convinced doctors and policymakers that randomized trials and systematic reviews should trump intuition and seniority?
Well, it's a great question. I don't think there was one turning point. The world doesn't really work that way, right? Often it's a kind of build up over time. But if I had one story that kind of symbolized one person, perhaps, who has been very influential in that and speaks to your question, it's a story I tell in the book of a doctor and researcher called Iain Chalmers. And in fact, he was the reason I wrote the book in the first place, because I met him and learned his story and kind of learnt the history, shall we say, of the modern evidence movement. And so I'll tell you his story briefly. I mean, he was a doctor. He trained in the 1960s and 70s in obstetrics and gynecology, and he noticed that different doctors would give different advice for the same condition. So, one doctor would recommend that women take prenatal vitamins, or that bed rest was really important in pregnancy, and another doctor would say no such thing. And what generally happened was that everyone would just follow the advice of the most senior doctor in the room, which is sometimes now called eminence-based medicine. So the most eminent doctor's advice would win. So Iain Chalmers was very confused by this and didn't know which treatment was most effective. And he came across some seminal work from a doctor called Archie Cochrane, who actually was sort of became a pioneering name in medicine for basically saying that the best way to work out whether one treatment is more effective than another is to use evidence, particularly evidence from randomized controlled trials. And randomized trials are basically when you assign a similar group of people randomly, one to take a treatment and one not, and then you compare whether the treatment group improves faster. So Iain Chalmers was inspired by this, became very interested in randomized trials, and ended up doing a massive synthesis of medical evidence to work out actually which treatments were the most effective in childbirth and pregnancy. And through this showed, it was a kind of remarkable work, it took him 10 years and multiple systematic reviews, which are a form of evidence synthesis, showed that in fact many practices in childbirth and pregnancy were not based on evidence, and some of them were actually doing harm. So women were being subjected to things like even surgical episiotomies, which was designed to give the baby a bigger hole to get out, were really not supported by evidence. So women were being subjected to these practices, even though they weren't, there was no evidence they were doing any good. And his work helped change things. And it sort of around over time, this idea of using evidence kind of gained momentum and became known, as you mentioned, in the 1990s as evidence-based medicine, which just means using the best available evidence when making decisions about patients. So yeah, not one turning point. It's much more of a kind of build up over time, I would say.
Dr. Helen, many of the people in your book are mavericks and rebels who challenge powerful institutions. What patterns did you notice in how they managed to push evidence into places that were initially resistant, like government departments or large aid agencies?
So yeah, I think it's such a good point that a lot of the characters I wrote about do have this rebellious streak, and that's because like Iain Chalmers I just talked about, it takes a certain type of person to be willing to basically speak truth to power, because a lot of the evidence movement has involved people saying, we've been doing this way for a long time, let's say this way in medicine, and actually this is not supported by evidence. So they had to be willing to stand up, I suppose, to the most senior doctor, for example. What patterns did I notice? I mean, apart from having those streaks, I mean, one thing I did notice is that sometimes they were sort of outsiders. And by that, I mean, so for example, Iain Chalmers was, he wasn't sort of, I mean, he worked in Oxford actually, but he wasn't sort of steeped in the sort of academic elite, I suppose. He was a little bit of an outsider, and so he was willing to make these sort of sometimes controversial statements. And I think that that's probably true. I mean, I've looked at fields from sort of, management to conservation, and again, yeah, people who were willing to sort of speak the truth. It was sometimes just a little bit outside perhaps the central circles. And the other pattern I would say they have is they were persistent. I mean, that they became very passionate about these ideas of using evidence and were very persistent over time, I think.
Professor, you explored difficult questions such as whether welfare programs actually help the poor or whether smaller classes improve learning. Can you walk us through one example where the evidence clearly overturned a widely held belief and how the people involved reacted to that uncomfortable truth?
Sure. So, I mean, one example in medicine is a process called knee arthroscopy, which is it is still, to be fair, but it was a very kind of common procedure where people with knee pain, perhaps knee arthritis, undergo this kind of keyhole surgery to remove some of the tissue in the knee. And the idea was that obviously this would improve their symptoms. But in fact, when this procedure was kind of put through rigorous trials, it was and compared to, for example, exercise therapy, it was actually shown that there was almost no difference, and the exercise therapy was better because people ended up with stronger muscles to support their knees. So, and this is a certainly was a very, very commonplace procedure. Now, you were saying kind of, what changed people's minds. I mean, there's a strong body of evidence now that this is not really better than exercise therapy, and I think it has helped reduce that. But that's actually a key challenge, is that sometimes the evidence can be there, but these practices are so ingrained that actually they're difficult to overturn. So I can't say, this isn't done anymore. I think sometimes it's a slow process, not a kind of sudden, switch off.
Because in an era of alternative facts and politicized science, what did you learn about why good evidence so often fails to change minds? And what kind of communication or storytelling seem to make evidence finally land with the public and with the leaders?
So I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it's almost like the frontier in some ways of this evidence movement I've looked at, is that a lot of fields from conservation to education to policy have now built up. There's a lot of evidence there, and the challenge has become much more about getting people to use it. For example, there's a lot of evidence about effective practices in education, but it doesn't necessarily mean those practices are being used. I would say, I mean, interestingly, there are actually researchers who now study this problem in its own right. So they sort of are saying, what is the evidence on how to get evidence used? And the answers are not simple. I mean, sometimes I point as a success story to evidence-based medicine. So let's think about, because in that field, it has become very standard practice. And I think some of the differences is that if you look at medicine, so for example, students in medicine learn about evidence-based practice when they're training as doctors. So, it's early in their career, they take it with them into practice when they go. So that's one thing, they have training. It's also kind of embedded in their practice that makes it easy for them. So for example, evidence syntheses of evidence called systematic reviews are routinely done, and on the basis of those, doctors develop what are called clinical guidelines. And clinical guidelines are what doctors use in the clinic to make decisions. So it's sort of easy for them. It's already there. And then the third thing I think that's really interesting about medicine is there's accountability. So if a doctor doesn't follow evidence-based practice and causes harm to someone, they're going to be held to account. Because of course patients will be angry, they might be sued, they might be removed from practice by their professional body, and those things of training and the embedding of evidence and accountability are not necessarily there in other fields. And so I think that's where these challenges are. I'm not saying that evidence, medicine is the perfect model for other fields, but I think this process of how to actually make it easy for people to use evidence is where a lot of perhaps work needs to be done from policy to education.
Professor, your book ranges from policing and crime to education, conservation and business. Was there a sector where you personally surprised by how little evidence had been used historically, and what happened when rigorous trials and data finally entered the picture.
So, I mean, I think it's surprising, all of it, that it's so recent. I mean, even in medicine, so the term evidence-based medicine was only introduced in the academic literature in 1991. So this is 35 years ago. So this is a really recent phenomenon. Obviously there were randomized trials being done before that, but this articulation that evidence ought to be used in decision making, even in medicine, is really recent. So I was very surprised by that. And most people who read the book are like, wow, we thought that medicine had always been based on evidence. I mean, beyond that, I think that so one field I think is really interesting, which is sort of not yet come round to evidence, and I was quite surprised by, is around business and management. So you can find people who are like, even in medicine, who are completely signed up to evidence-based medicine, and they do it in their medical practice. But when it comes to managing a team of people, they don't think to use evidence, even though there's this kind, and I would count myself in that, because I was a manager, and people just, you follow sort of random business books, or you just do what your boss tells you. So there's quite a lack of evidence-based practice, and I mean, just to explain, there is actually a huge wealth of evidence, for example, looking at whether practices like performance-related pay work, or performance appraisals, or feedback, or these practices that managers have, and whether they work or not. So I think that was quite surprising, for what you sort of hope that maybe businesses are run and managers are using evidence to think about how to run effective teams, but that's not necessarily the case.
Dr. Helen, a recurring tension in the book is that randomized control trials and statistical evidence can feel cold or technocratic. How do the individuals and organizations you profile balance the rigor of evidence with values, context, and the lived experiences of people affected by decisions?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. And I mean, one of the sort of central tenets of evidence-based medicine is that evidence alone is not enough to tell you what to do. I think that's almost a naive view of evidence, that you go into the doctor and you look up the evidence, and then obviously the decision is simple, and it doesn't work that way. So in evidence-based medicine, what actually happens in an ideal world is that evidence would give you an indication of which treatment might be most effective, but there is also, before the decision is made, there's also the expertise of the doctor, who has very valuable expertise built up over the years, who's trying to work out how the evidence applies to this particular patient. And of course, what's really important is the values and preferences of the patient. So for example, let's say somebody has a pneumonia, and we know that there are antibiotics which can cure that infection, but clearly, if that person is at the end of their life and they've chosen not to have any more treatment, then the evidence shows the treatment is effective, but you won't use it. So I think that's that's a really important tenet. And similarly, in policy making, the hope is that evidence will be used in the decision-making process to indicate, to show what particular policy might be most effective in this situation. But policymakers have to consider other things. I mean, they rightly have to consider politics and the local opinions and costs. So again, evidence is just one part of that. And my sense is that all these people, that I wrote about, and all the people I've interviewed, because I've interviewed probably like well over 200 people about evidence over the last few years, are all just trying to make sure that evidence is at least part of the conversation when kind of key decisions are being made.
Professors show that building an evidence-based culture is slow, political, and sometimes messy work. Were there any failures or unintended consequences in the stories you uncovered that change how you think about the limit of evidence-based decision making?
Failures. Well, I mean, I suppose I think quite an interesting. I don't know if it's a failure, but it certainly COVID highlighted lots of tensions around evidence. And I actually wrote a piece for Nature called "How COVID Broke the Evidence Pipeline," because there were so many difficulties around that. And I think, I mean, the whole interesting debate about the use of face masks was quite sort of highlighted some of the difficulties with evidence. And that was because, interestingly, so, this idea that in evidence-based medicine, you look at see whether something is effective from randomized controlled trials. So some people in the pandemic were sort of saying, well, we can't introduce policies around face masks because there aren't, until we have good evidence from randomized controlled trials that they really, help prevent infections. Whereas other people were much more pragmatic and were saying, look, we haven't got good evidence from randomized controlled trials. And by the way, that's a really difficult trial to do around masking. But there's all this other evidence that does suggest that masks might reduce infections, the fact that they create a physical barrier, for example. And so it was it sort of highlight, it was almost that evidence-based medicine, people are taking this a little bit too far. And sometimes, that there's a much more pragmatic approach around just synthesizing the best evidence that we've got and making a practical decision. So I think that highlighted definitely some of the limits around evidence. And people still have concerns, I think, within evidence-based medicine that there's too much kind of primacy. People put randomized controlled trials on this pedestal, that it has to be this particular gold standard form of evidence. But there are many forms of evidence from research, and there's also evidence from lived experience, and all of these are really important forms of information. And so I think one of the challenges now is how do we bring the relevant pieces of information together for the decision at hand.
Professor, for listeners who are managers, policymakers, or social entrepreneurs, what practical habits from the evidence revolutionaries in your book can they borrow tomorrow if they want to quietly make their own organization more evidence-based in its decisions?
Yes, so that's a great question. And at the back of my book, I put some evidence hacks to help people kind of join the evidence revolution. I mean, the most simple thing people can do is to just pause a minute, and certainly if you encounter a claim, let's say, and just to say, okay, where's the evidence? Like to sort of ask for the evidence behind a claim. That's the first thing. Now, I mean, this is more about, for example, if you encounter a claim on social media, let's say, if there is, and that would involve kind of, saying, okay, well, is there a study or some research behind it? Now, if there is, then the question is, well, is it a good study or research? Because there's lots of bad research in the world as well. A really basic step around that would be to say, has the study been peer reviewed and published in a journal? Peer review, is this process by which other experts will scrutinize a piece of research. It's absolutely not foolproof. So lots of bad research gets through peer review, but it's kind of a crude indicator, at least, of a piece of valid research. And another thing I would say, and this is something I've changed in my own practice as a science journalist, is that I now am much more likely when I'm going into a new field to look for syntheses of evidence. So, for example, something like a systematic review, because the danger with looking at one study is that it might be wrong, it might be flawed, there might be other studies which conflict. And so, and of course, the world is complicated and there's lots of science in the world. So I think looking for evidence syntheses or systematic reviews is also a kind of really powerful way to start to understand the evidence. Yeah.
Dr. Helen, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. At a personal level, after spending years immersed in this global movement, has writing Beyond Belief changed how you make decisions in your own life as a journalist, a teacher, and a parent? And if so, could you share a concrete example where you consciously choose evidence over opinion?
Yes, it has. I mean, I mentioned one, which is that now I tend to look for systematic reviews. And I would say I do that in my work as a science journalist. I'm going to a new field, but I do also do it in, like, I don't know, let's say I've had a medical diagnosis or something like that. I do tend to look for overviews rather than just be swayed by one study. I mean, yes, I do it as a parent as well. I've got 3 kids, and I suppose one example which I did actually write about in the book is around, because like all parents, I wrestle with how much time my kids should be on screens and phones, which is kind of like, the parenting question of the modern age for many people. And so I did go off and do and actually ended up writing a piece about this for Nature as well. And I sort of, I really wanted to be informed by the evidence, right? Like, how do I set boundaries for my children? And the interesting thing was, and this is a live debate at the moment, right? And it's very unsettled. I suppose I really wanted the evidence to give me this clear answer of like, well, your kid, your child should only have 2 hours a day or something like that, or clearly the evidence shows that I mean, this is the sort of message maybe I think a lot of parents get is that, for example, using screens and smartphones this is the idea is supposedly contributing to adolescent mental health problems. Now, actually, if you look at the evidence, it's much more complex than that. And I mean, I reported on this for Nature. It's the evidence, for example, around social media, smartphones, and adolescent mental health is quite contested, and maybe has small effects at best. So anyway, back to my story, how do I deal with that as a parent? I mean, it was actually in some ways it's quite empowering sometimes to know that you've looked for the evidence and it's not there. It doesn't give you the crisp answers you want, because it's still that empowers you to go, okay, I've looked and I'm able to make decisions based on what I think is what's right for my family and what's important to me. So it goes back a bit to what you were saying before about evidence being sort of one factor in a decision. So I looked at the evidence. It didn't necessarily give me all the answers I want. I nevertheless felt informed and was able to come up with some type of rules and boundaries for my children.
Dr. Helen Pearson, thank you for taking us inside the evidence revolution and showing how careful, rigorous thinking can genuinely change lives and institutions. Your insights on moving from opinion to proof will stay with our listeners long after this conversation ends. It has been a privilege to host you on Business Talk today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.